What I want to talk to you about tonight is the Reagan strategy. This is the book I'm writing. I've been researching this for a number of years, and what I do is look at Reagan's approach to achieving his objectives when he was president. And basically what I do is kind of a systematic military style analysis so that we can look at it as a strategy and see what he did and how we could adapt it to the needs that we have. So the first thing, this is a little bit of a new thing in the brief, and what this is a sound clip from Reagan himself. He recorded this in 1961, and what he was doing was putting out information in opposition to socialized medicine. This goes pretty quickly, but I think it's quite timely.
Alarmingly vote against it. We had an example of this under the Truman administration. It was proposed that we have a compulsory health insurance program for all people in the United States, and of course the American people unhesitatingly rejected this. So, with the American people on record as not wanting socialized medicine, Congressman Farrand introduced the Farrand Bill. This was the idea that all people of Social Security age should be brought under a program of compulsory health insurance. Now, this would not only be our senior citizens, this would be the dependents and those who are disabled. This would be young people if they are dependents of someone eligible for Social Security. Now, Congressman Farrand brought the program out on that idea of just for that particular group of people. But Congressman Farrand was subscribing to this foot-in-the-door philosophy because he said, if we can only break through and get our foot inside the door, then we can expand the program after that.
So we saw this coming 52 years ago. That's how long ago Reagan said that. So we're going to look very quickly at principles and objectives, assumptions, those were very important, and then Reagan's strategy. Now we're talking about the strategy with which he approached what he wanted to do as president. Liberty, limited government, strong defense. So I don't think we need to talk a whole lot about that. Reagan's principles were very simple, and they're really the principles that we should have today. His objectives, Reagan wanted to reduce the size of government. He actually did in some areas, which is quite remarkable. No other president in the 20th century was able to achieve that. Calvin Coolidge at least kept it from getting any bigger. Improve our national defense posture. And roll back the gains of communism. And this is especially important because it went beyond containment. He wanted to roll it back. He wanted to take back from the communists what they had gained. So he was not interested in preserving the status quo. He was interested in reversing and getting a new status quo. That's very important. His assumptions, the bottom line for Reagan was that an evil system is unsustainable. It's just inherently unsustainable. It has to work too hard to sustain itself, to repress people, and so if you give it a push, it's going to have to collapse. Oops. This is his quote on the top. Reagan said that in 1981. Evil is powerless if the good are unafraid. I've got that one framed, hanging over my desk, because Reagan believed that. I would love it if more people in Washington, more people in Sacramento believed it. That's what we're going to have to do, is take our cue from Reagan and internalize that and believe it. Liberty is the way to improve man's condition. Liberty isn't a negative condition, it's a positive condition. It is the path to improvement. Government management and control is not the path to improvement. And Reagan made that point over and over again. Okay, the strategy. We've looked at the principles, objectives, and assumptions. Now we're on to the strategy. The strategy for Reagan started with homework. Reagan spent several decades, learning facts and theory, coming to a philosophy of government. This was exceptionally important, and it's something that I think a lot of people more people are doing today. We just need to keep on plugging and keep doing our homework, because when Reagan came from the perspective of knowing what he was talking about, as he did with his socialized medicine recording, that was a 33 1/3 RPM LP, by the way. It was, you know, played it on your record player. That's how it got out to people.
What's a record player?
Some of us are old enough to remember record players. This one was a 33 1/3, yeah. But my grandparents had the old glass 78 RPM record players. And the level of information that Reagan absorbed, okay, thanks, was quite remarkable. This next clip is going to show you how he basically trounced. Okay, we'll give it a shot here.
It's on.
It's on. Testing. Can you hear me? Okay. This next clip is Reagan trouncing a young kid who is, he and Bobby Kennedy are in a debate. This was in 1967. And Kennedy was basically on the sidelines, not saying very much. At the end of this debate, he told his handlers, "Don't ever put me up against that SOB again," talking about Reagan. And you'll see why, because Reagan just blows this kid away.
I disagree.
The Diem regime, would you say that the Diem regime was a popular one, or was it one which you imposed on a people and which the people then rebelled against?
I doubt that you could make much of a case. I challenge your history. In 1954,
the history of the Diem regime, sir?
I do, because there was a referendum taken in 1954 in which 90% of the people voted in a referendum for Diem to take the position that he took. He was subsequently endorsed in 2 other elections, a few years in which they elected both a General Assembly for his government that was preponderantly pro-Diem. They re-elected him to his position. We could hardly have installed a puppet regime at a time when we had less than 700 unarmed military advisors, many of them non-commissioned officers, helping to teach the South Vietnamese how to organize an army for protection against guerrillas in their own country.
Are you saying that you approve of the activities of the Diem regime?
What activities?
You approve that they put 6 million in forced prison camps, and that the American advisors did nothing but help them in this?
I challenge your history again. There is absolutely no record that 6 million people were put in concentration camps. They only have 16 million to begin with. Now, I'd also like to challenge something else about the supposed evils of the Diem regime. I do approve of Diem's land reform, in which he took from the great Mandarin holdings and began to make land available to the peasants and to the people of Vietnam who had never owned. But also, I would like to call to your attention that a team from the United Nations was sent to Saigon, to Vietnam, to investigate the charges made against the Diem regime. They did investigate those, but as they returned to this country, Diem was assassinated, which I think was one of the great tragedies of this whole conflict. And the United Nations report, which they declined to make official because they thought, why bring anything up now that he's been killed, has, on the other hand, been published. There has been public access to it, and the United Nations report completely cleared the Diem regime of any of the charges that had been brought against it.
Governor, let's get Senator.
So that is the level of homework that we're talking about, the mastery of facts. And what that allowed Reagan to do was confront. He did his homework, and that made him able to confront his political opponents. particularly important episode in his life was the period of union bargaining when he was the head of the Screen Actors Guild. An anecdote that I like to tell with this brief relates to when the communists were trying to take over the unions. And they made a particular effort to get hold of the unions that ran Hollywood because they wanted to exert control over the content of American films. And they were making inroads on that with some of the producers and writers and so forth who, you know, many of whom were communists, some of them card-carrying, some of them just sympathizers. But they wanted to get hold of the unions so that they would have the leverage of work stoppage to get the studio bosses in, so that they could hold them in line. And Reagan, basically, he and about 7 other actors discovered that this was going on. They had to do some digging. They had to fly to Chicago several times to figure out what was going on. But at one point, a very critical point, there was about to be a SAG vote, a Screen Actors Guild vote, on which way to go. And the communists wanted them to go one way, and Reagan and his group of actors realized that they needed to go the other way. There was a meeting that met at Ida Lupino's house. That's why her picture is up there. And it was about 75 people. About 20 of them were kind of what Paul Kengor calls dupes. He wrote the book called Dupes about communists and their inroads in the United States. And what they did was bring these people in, and they didn't understand what they were being asked to do and try to sell them on the program of the communists. Well, the actor William Holden, who of course was a good friend of Reagan, called him up the night this was happening. They hadn't been informed about this meeting, but Bill Holden found out about it. He called Reagan and said, "We need to get over there." And Reagan said, "Yep, you're right, we do." So they went over and they crashed Ida Lupino's party. And this really happened. Ron Radosh, in his book about the Hollywood communists, recounted this, and it's also in several other people's stories. Reagan himself wrote about it. And they got there, they saw what was going on. The communists were trying to sell their program for the takeover of the unions to people who didn't understand what the deal was. And they waited until there was a break in the discussion, and then Reagan stood up and asked for the floor. And he was an acknowledged leader at that point. He hadn't been elected the head of the Screen Actors Guild yet, but he was known to be a leader, so the dupes there, the would-be dupes, said, "Sure, we'll listen to Reagan." And the communists really couldn't say no to that, so Reagan stood up and talked for about 40 minutes. And what he did was explain what he and the other actors had found out about the machinations that were going on in the background to try and take over the unions. And by the end of it, there were people scurrying around in the background of this party, being dragged out outside on the patio, being taken out to stand behind trees and yelled at. It was really, Reagan called it a Kilkenny brawl. It was just amazing. But that was the critical point at which he confronted these folks, and the communists yelled at him. They got in his face, they were screaming at him, and he stood firm, and that was the point at which SAG was basically saved from going communist. And what's critical about that is that Reagan's style was to confront directly. He didn't go through the press. He didn't stand behind lawyers. He went and stood right in front of the people who were opposed to him and talked to them face to face. And he got very good at this. He did it with the Democrats and, of course, with the Soviet leaders. It was just a talent that he developed and got very good at. So confrontation, that's the second leg of the strategy. Shape the debate, of course. Those two things lead into the requirement to get your message out on your terms. Reagan was a very disciplined communicator. He was a great communicator, but part of that was his discipline. He was always positive and hopeful. He never went out and tried to run other people down. He always talked about positive and hopeful things about his program. He was confident that the people would listen if he did that, and he ignored red herrings. They're always, you know, the media, the Democrats, whoever, they're always throwing up red herrings, trying to get us to talk about those things. Reagan ignored them. He was very good at that. So, having reached this point, what did Reagan want to do as sort of the guts of his strategy? Build up America's strength. If he had only tried to tear down the Soviet Union, it wouldn't have worked. He had to build up America's strength. And we remember the economic, political, and even spiritual renewal of the United States, certainly greater economic liberty. He knew that if he unleashed the people, America would go through the roof in terms of economic strength. And that's exactly what happened. The correlation of strength shifted in our favor because he did that. Even if he hadn't done anything else to the Soviets, we would still have been, our strength relative to them would have increased. But the other thing he did was put pressure on evil. He did this unabashedly. And remember, he didn't have any problem referring to communism as evil. And it's evil, it's unsustainable, we're going to put pressure on it. There were four particular dimensions I want to talk about. And the first is political, moral, and spiritual, because this was actually extremely important. His speeches, of course, very important elements of what he did. His speeches were extremely memorable. Of all the presidents we've had in the 20th century, Reagan has by far the largest number of memorable speeches that we remember lines from. We'll have one more clip here.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
You can't have a brief about Reagan without that speech. It's worth noting that not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, not six, but 7 times Reagan had to go back to his policymakers and speechwriters and put that line back into his speech. They kept taking it out. That was Reagan's line all the way. Prisoners of conscience, this is something that a lot of people don't know. I like to get this in because Reagan carried in the pocket of his suit, in the breast pocket, he carried a folded up sheet of paper, and it had lists of names on it, and the names would change as people were released. But he carried it around, and what it was people, prisoners of conscience, Soviet Jews, Soviet Christians, just Soviet dissidents, people whom he was trying to get released. He carried it around, and George Shultz wrote afterward how important it was to Reagan. This was basically what Shultz thinks is that he carried this list over his heart because that's the level of importance it had to him to get these folks released. Extremely, of course, many of you are probably aware of Natan Sharansky writing about when Reagan gave the Evil Empire speech, that the political dissidents who were jailed in Russia were, they had their knocking code on the wall to communicate with each other, and they were knocking like crazy throughout the Lubyanka prison to let each other know that Reagan had said that, because it was like a new wind blowing through their political lives, and they could see light at the end of the tunnel. Candles for Poland, December 1981. In December of 81, we don't even remember this today, but the Polish ambassador, this was at a time when Poland was in great crisis, and the Polish ambassador had just defected. He defected on Christmas Eve of 1981. And Reagan put candles in the window of the White House and asked Americans to put candles for Poland out, and people all over the country did it. And I remembered that when I read about it again, but I hadn't thought about it for years. These little things, and Poles remember that. Every Pole who was alive then remembers that that happened. Personal letters to the Soviet leaders. Obama just had his letter to Hassan Rouhani of Iran. I'm quite sure, actually, because we see him trying to do a lot of things that are in the style of Reagan, that he did this because of Reagan's penchant for writing letters to the Soviet leaders. That's not something that presidents had typically done. It was something that was unique to Reagan, and there's a reason he did it. The reason is that by putting his thoughts down on paper for the other leader, he could communicate directly from himself. He wasn't having to go through the media, through a diplomat, through any other means. He was writing directly to the other leader. And he actually had a correspondence with each of the Soviet leaders who, as he said, kept dying on him while he was in office. But the fact that he wrote what he wanted to do and then he did it, and he stuck to his guns, stuck with them. Gorbachev said that later. Okay, now we are to the what I call the geographizing. And this is actually very important. It's associating your aims with territory, because people live on territory. You can't win a political battle for hearts and minds if you're not arranging for people to live on territory in a way that's viable and that gives them a future. So Reagan thought about this intensely. What I'm showing you here is the 1970s view of the East-West confrontation. And I think of this one as being driven by the map, the narrow view of the big mean Soviet Union on one side and little bitty Western Europe on the other side. And it all looks very scary on that Soviet side of the divide. You know, we sit there and we're scared of what's on the other side, and it dictates to us the posture that we have to have. This is how we reacted to the Soviet Union from 1945 up until Reagan took office. Reagan had a different view. He saw the Soviets basically as surrounded, and the map not as something that dictated to us, but as something that we could use. If the Soviets were surrounded, then there were a lot of ways that we could put pressure on them, and that's what we're going to look at here. One was sabotaging their gas pipelines, very important to them. Reagan was able to impose some political delays, but he couldn't get the Europeans to buy into not buying gas from the USSR. Understandable. They really wanted to diversify the ways that they could get natural gas. So he was never able to cut the Soviets off from the European market. But he was able to get the pipeline delayed, and by using the CIA, he was able to achieve sabotage, introducing little things into pieces of equipment that would malfunction, and these things actually did happen. Yeah, it worked out, and it slowed the Soviets down. There we go. Clamp down on controlled technology. Today, China gives us lists of what China wants us to relax our controls on. When Reagan came in, he said, we're not going to do anything like that. And he did actually slow the Soviets down by doing that. Deregulating oil. This was a biggie. This was a big twofer. Deregulating oil was a huge boost to the Western economies. It was also a huge hit to the Soviet economy because it drove the prices down. The price of a barrel of oil plummeted in the early 1980s, and it stayed low for 2 decades afterward. And it really bit into Soviet profits. Their biggest export was oil, and They took huge hits. Hard currency was much harder for them to come by. In terms of political, using the map politically, of course, this was the Reagan doctrine. Support to insurgencies and freedom movements, Afghanistan, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, of course, Poland, Czechoslovakia. It was Czechoslovakia then. In Latin America. Grenada, we tend not to realize this, but Grenada in 1983 was the first time that anyone in the West rolled back the gains that communism had made. From 1917 on, no gains were rolled back until 1983, when we rolled back the gains in Grenada, went in and did a takeover, and established a democratic government there. And of course, striking at the terror clients and containing the Iran-Iraq war. All these ways that the Soviets had of messing with the third world, messing with us and our allies on the margins, Reagan was able to go around plugging up holes and keeping those things under control. So, looking at that NATO-Warsaw Pact line again, in the context of the Soviet Union being surrounded, it looks a little bit different. Reagan started putting intense pressure on it. The Soviets had had us buffaloed for about a decade prior to Reagan taking office, first threatening and then actually moving in the SS-20 theater missiles. These were missiles that would threaten Western Europe, and the beauty of it was that he could intimidate Western Europe without threatening to hit the United States. So the idea was it was a way of dividing the NATO alliance and creating a situation that was very advantageous to the Soviets. Jimmy Carter threatened to do something about it and gave the Soviets the option of being nice or we would do something, and of course we never did anything under Jimmy Carter. Well, Reagan started...
the second worst president.
I'm afraid you're right. Reagan started out right down at the bottom at what the Navy calls the deck plate level with his pressure, with a new strategy which the Army had proposed and he approved called air-land battle. And that was basically a take the fight to the Soviets shift. Instead of sitting there in a defensive crouch, our doctrine and strategy became that if anything broke on the Central Front in Europe, we would immediately start going into Eastern Europe and taking out targets there. We would take the fights to the Soviets. And that alarmed the Soviet Army quite a bit. But Reagan didn't stop there. The Pershing II missile, this was the counterpart to the SS-20, which Carter had been threatening to put in. Reagan actually put it in 1983. And got to give props to Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl. They were instrumental in getting the SS-20, the Pershing II put in spite of a lot of protests in Western Europe. Ground-launched cruise missiles, these aren't even there anymore, but they significantly complicated the Soviets' defense problem. The world changed around them, basically, once Reagan was in office. And all of this technology had been developed prior to Reagan entering office. It was just that Reagan deployed it. The air-launched cruise missiles, which are the air-launched version of the ground-launched cruise missiles, these B-52s could launch from the United States and come in from either the east or the west and deploy these against the Central Front or against the Far East. The Navy Tomahawk missile, these could be deployed from submarines or surface ships, and using what was called the maritime strategy, the US Navy began camping out much closer to the Soviet coastline than we ever had before. So air-land battle, the maritime strategy, all these missiles, this literally all developed in the 1980s under Reagan. This is how the Soviets' defense picture changed. So with all of that in mind, the Strategic Defense Initiative was the icing on the cake. Corner them, so that really the only thing they have left is to go thermonuclear if they think they're going to have to fight a war with us, and then put up a missile defense shield so that they can't execute a first strike and expect it to do anything. That was the posture of strength from which Reagan went in to negotiate with the Soviets. It enabled him to say no to a bad deal. He was offered what was called at the time the deal of the century in 1986. The entire Western world wanted him to take that deal. What the Soviets offered was basically everything Reagan had asked for in 1981 in terms of reducing nuclear weapons, if he would just get rid of the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Soviets, and now the Russians, have always liked MAD. They like mutual assured destruction. It's important to them. For Reagan, it was important to not have that because he didn't think that was the right way, to have nuclear missiles hanging over most of the world's population as the method of keeping the nations at peace with each other. But he said no to that deal. Almost all of his advisors were upset and concerned about the fact that he said no. This was in 1986. But then about 9 months later, he was signing the INF Treaty, which was basically everything Gorbachev had offered, except that Reagan didn't give up SDI, in December of 1987. So, what I want to do now, very quickly, is go through and look at potential applications of this strategy to the time that we live in now, a Reagan strategy for our time. And it is a different time. The society has changed somewhat in the last 30 years. Our geopolitical consensus out there, the Pax Americana, as we've called it, is basically falling apart. It still existed in January 2009. It no longer exists. It's basically because of one person, the president that we have right now, that we no longer have it. But there's no single focus of evil in the modern world. Reagan was able to identify a single focus of evil. We have a much changed situation here because there isn't a single focus of evil. So that's going to change some of the ways that we look at things. That being said, it's the same old evil that's out there. Redistributionism. We see it through environmental alarmism, which I think everyone here is well aware is a method of gaining political control of as many people as possible. Political Islamism, that's another way of trying to gain control of people. And in the 1960s, radicalism in the United States, that, of course, is headed for the ash heap of history. Unfortunately, it's in the White House right now, but it is headed for the ash heap of history. Its last sad chapter is even now being written. Because it's evil, it's unsustainable, right? But these globalist ideologies are embedded in the supranational bodies. The UN and all its various agencies, it's becoming pervasive in local government. Some of you are probably aware of how Agenda 21, for example, is embedded in the development plans for the urban areas in California. Islamism is also becoming a state-based threat, not just itinerant insurgents and terrorists, but guys who get elected and stand behind podiums. We hope we've dodged a bullet with Mr. Morsi there, but we'll see how that goes. And then big power threats on the old school model of balance of power, military power. China, for example, Russia is that type of power today. So there are a lot of different threats out there, no single focus of evil. So, what's our homework? We have to start our strategy with homework. And there's some boilerplate here that's very important. We have to know who we are. I think one of the problems Republicans have right now is that there are divisions among us. We haven't found, let me point it out here, what unifies us. We tend to spend an awful lot of time on what divides us. And we're looking for what unifies us. and what are the things that we must not give up. What does liberty mean to us? What does it mean to have small government? These are things that in some ways we've lost touch with. So we need to be putting a lot of work into that. And I think there are a lot of great guys out there, guys and gals, people writing, blogging, talk radio, a lot of good discussion going on out there. So there's good stuff going on in that area. We need to be renewal-oriented as much as possible. There's renewal-oriented, that's talking up the positive, why it's good to have limited government and liberty, versus threat-oriented. We do have to know the threat. We have to understand it. There's no question about that. But we can't be talking mainly about that. We need to be talking about what's good and positive, what will inspire people, because that's what gives them hope and a future. And develop our comprehensive perspective, what Reagan had when he went off to confront. So going head-to-head with political opponents. There are different schools of thought about this. This is a suggestion. There can be more than one. My suggestion is that the local level, school boards, city councils, state legislatures, this is where we're going to have to make our stand. And we're going to see how we geographize that here in just a minute. As much as we would love to just turn everything around at the national level and have all the local stuff follow, I don't think it's going to work that way. I think we have to do the hard work, turn things around at the local level, and then we'll be able to turn them around at the national level. Shaping the debate, I don't think anyone thinks we're there yet in terms of shaping the debate. We need faces, we need voices. We've got, again, good folks out there, bloggers, pundits, talk radio, politicians. We've got great folks out there, but no one who's surging toward the national level yet. And Ted Cruz, absolutely, yeah. He's an awesome guy. I think we've got some terrific people out there, and hey, you know, it may be Ted Cruz in 2016. We'll have to see. But between now and 2016, we've got to get through the next 3 years. So again, boilerplate, building strength, rebuilding character, starting from behind, putting pressure on evil, calling it out. We do have to do that. We have to identify it. But we need to be talking as much as possible about the ideas and benefits of freedom. Why is it better? It's not just that trying to use government to control everything doesn't work. It's that unleashing the people and giving them liberty does work. You get a good result with that. You can count on it. It always happens. And of course, stand, don't run. I don't want anyone here moving to Costa Rica. You got to stay here, and we're all going to fight this together. Okay, so geographizing the strategy. There's some hope.
Wow.
This was 1984, but you know what? It doesn't look as different as you might think it does today. Reagan and Mondale, 1984, little tiny blue islands in a big sea of red. This was 2004 when Bush had a nice hefty win over Kerry. But you can see there's Blue Creek there on the coast of California and down around Miami and up in Connecticut, Maine, you know, the Northeast, along the Mississippi there. And there's more blue. There's no question there's more blue in 2012. And things have changed, but there's still a lot of red out there. One thing I like about this map is that it shows you can see how much of an edge there was for Republicans or Democrats by the shade of the color that you're seeing. So In San Bernardino County, for example, that big light blue spot in Southern California, it's light blue. The edge was not intense. And so there are areas here that, that we can look at taking back. Riverside County used to be a darker red. Now it's a lighter red. So, you know, there's work to do there. Ventura County, go figure. I just want to slap those people upside the head. But up in the Northeast, for example, there's a lot of light blue. So, you know, we shouldn't just assume that we can't start turning some of these red, even if it's a light red. This is the map that we have to work with, I think. This is the territory, because what can we do? We've got to fight for the United States. We've got to turn territory to Republican candidates. And there are some other things that should give us a little bit of hope. On yesterday, a columnist in the Washington Post pointed out that the mood of Americans as measured by their responses on policy questions, not asking people, are you conservative or are you liberal, but asking them for their particular responses on policy questions, the mood is the most conservative it has been since 1952. So people are giving conservative responses on policy questions. We can work with that. GOP State House gains in 2010 and 2012. As you can see, well, it's kind of hard to see on this map, but the Republicans own both the executive and the legislature in 26 states now, which is pretty remarkable. And, right, in the state houses. And we had huge gains in 2010. There were about 680 seats that Republicans gained across the country. And we did not lose those gains. Some seats changed hands, some went to Democrats, but seats came back for Republicans in other places. So we didn't lose any of those gains in 2012, even with the Obama victory. People tend to forget that 12 months ago, no Democrat wanted Obama coming and campaigning for him in his district. You know, the president was political poison at that point. So Democrats haven't suddenly become monolithic in the last 3 weeks. And we've had some big policy wins at the grassroots and state level. The negotiation with teachers in New Jersey, I don't agree with Chris Christie on a lot of things, but you know, he was able to knock the teachers in line there in New Jersey. In Wisconsin, Scott Walker and the public union bargaining position, he was just upheld by a federal judge. So he's winning the wickets on that. Colorado, of course, the two recall elections, the gun rights elections, just had big victories in those. So using the map, again, we've got to mobilize for those local issues, local elections. And something that Susan pointed out is so important. The encroachment of property assessments. Not raising the rate of our property taxes, but adding these little assessments. And how is that done? That's done at the local level. Counties, cities, going around and referenda, asking us to vote on, to basically increase our property taxes until the effective tax rate is 2 or 3 times the official rate at which we're being taxed. We've got to be in there fighting those battles. And we need to get faces known. The rally point, we really need to be looking at policy issues. It's great, it is very important to talk about philosophy and the meaning of freedom and so forth. Those things are all important. What people can typically unite around is policy issues. Taxes, regulation that kills businesses, development policy, when people find out what's being planned for their communities, that, you know, down the street they're planning to put in a high density residential, you know, with 50% low income housing or whatever, that gets people exercised. These are the things that if we win seats, we can start taking back control of. So taking that map and starting to turn it more red or from blue to red, little by little, incrementally, is one idea of geographizing this. Remembering Reagan's difference between containment and rollback, he wanted to roll it back. Well, that's what I want to do too. We need to make that map more red. What's ours is ours. What's theirs is ours too. Reagan ended it with a negotiation where he got to sit down and sign a historic treaty. And basically signing that treaty was, it broke the back of communism, and the wall came down 2 years later and the Soviet Union collapsed 2 years after that. So preparing for a negotiation, we need to be building up strength to prepare for it. At some point, maybe we're even looking at a constitutional convention. I know there are folks out there who are already thinking along those lines. Mark Levin, of course, has his list of potential amendments, and I think there's a lot to be interested in there. That is the sort of thing for which we have to lay the groundwork. We have to build up our strength. We have to surround the Germans had a military strategy that they called Kesselschlacht. Anyone who speaks German here might understand that means cauldron battle. Surround and annihilate. I call Reagan's strategy Reaganschlacht because he looked at the Soviet Union and said, I'm going to surround it and annihilate it. Surround it, put pressure on it as if it's in a cauldron, bring it to a boil, and it collapses. Well, that's what we need to do. We need to take back so much territory that when we get to these points here, we have the strength to negotiate and get what we want. One possibility. So we got to lay the groundwork for that. Reagan negotiating the INF Treaty, we got to go in strong. And remember, evil is powerless if the good are unafraid. And that's the Reagan strategy.